Hi, everybody. Marvin Rappaport here, a member of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Public Library Local History Committee. I'm pleased to be joined by two other members of the committee as well. Lynn Skolnick, who was a former president of the board of the library and is chair of the Local History Committee. Alan Barish, longtime director of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Library before it moved to its current location in what was originally the Daveco or Strauss store on Broadway, and Myron Gittell, who is also on our local affairs committee and a longtime member of the community. We have the privilege today, well, let me back up one more second. We've been doing oral histories, local oral histories of individuals who grew up in the Monticello and Sullivan County area, with a view to painting a picture of what it was like growing up in the mostly 50s and 60s in Monticello. We had, if you go to the webpage that you'll be able to get to when we're done, you'll find that we also interviewed John Conway, our county historian, about the history of Monticello from the 1800s up through the current day. So that's one part of the puzzle. Today, what we're going to try to do is do a virtual walking tour of Broadway in the 50s and the 60s. And I'm pleased to have, or we're pleased to have as our interviewee, Dennis Diuguid, who grew up in Monticello and frankly knows more about the stores on Broadway and how Monticello developed than almost anybody that I know, having gone to school together, Dennis and I. Dennis, welcome, and I hope you'll be able to take us on this tour today.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning, as they say. Dennis, tell us when and where you were born, and where did you live first in Monticello? That helps set the scene for what we're going to do is this virtual tour through Broadway.
I was born in 1946. On Hamilton Avenue at the Hamilton Avenue Hospital. And
where did you live at first?
I lived after the war, after World War II, when the veterans came back. There was a project that was called the Veterans Project, and it was on the corner of Wood Avenue and Monticello Street, where the Jefferson apartments are today. And the mostly are all veterans lived there. They had wooden sidewalks, and my parents lived there.
Tell us your parents' name, please. Tell us your parents' name.
John was my father, and May was my mother.
Okay. And you lived there with?
Lived there with my brother. He's 2 years older than I.
His name?
John, also John.
Okay.
And they came back from the war, and that's the first place I remember us living. I think my brother lived in White Lake towards the end of the war, because my grandparents were from White Lake, and my father was overseas.
So we'll back up one more second. How did you get to Sullivan County? You mentioned grandparents in White Lake. When did your family come to Sullivan County?
They came to Sullivan County right after the Depression. My grandfather owned a Hupmobile agency in Brooklyn with his brothers. There was 5 brothers, and they owned this Hupmobile agency. And of course, during the Depression, it went bankrupt. And he was a mechanic. He was a mechanic, and one brother was a bookkeeper, and one brother was a salesperson. And when it went down the tubes, they had a summer house in White Lake. And they just moved up to White Lake because of the Depression. They lived on the lake where Gene's boat dock is now. My grandparents owned that property, and that's where they lived.
Great.
And so, that was right after the Depression.
Okay. And at some point, you left the Jefferson Street apartments and moved where?
we
Or your
moved,
parents
we moved
had a
around.
business?
We moved to several different places. Apartment, we were apartment dwellers, but then we bought a house on Lawrence Avenue. And on Lawrence Avenue, we owned this little house. Who lived on the street, the Madnicks from White Lumber, and guy worked at the A&P, Coggy Cogswell, and different people. It's just a neighborhood on Lawrence Avenue.
And what did your parents do?
My father was generally a truck driver. My mother was a bookkeeper. That was her main job. She worked for Monticello Gas and Oil. She worked for Murray Glick for 10 years or so. That was in the late 50s, early 60s, and they bought a bar around 1956 called Pat Visco's, and it was an Italian restaurant and bar, 3-story building, old Victorian type building.
Where was it?
It was at the corner of it wasn't at the corner. It was on Jefferson Street. At the corner was the Civil War monument, and then the bar, and then a parking lot for the bar.
Roughly where the neighborhood facility is today.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And across the street was a Shell station. Catsy Paul had a Shell station, and Manny worked there, the oldest son, and Alan, and Ronnie, though Ronnie was just a few years older than me, so he didn't work. So he worked like I worked, nothing.
Did you end up moving into that building where the restaurant was?
Yes, it was a 3-story building, used to be a rooming house. And the first floor, of course, was the bar, the restaurant, the kitchen. The second floor we used as an apartment. I had a room, and in my bedroom was a sink. It was a rooming house. So you had a sink and no switch on the wall, the pull string in the middle, and a common bathroom in the hallway. And my parents had a room, but they had another bathroom, and my brother had his own room. And then there was a third floor, but we didn't rent out apartments. We didn't rent rooms. That just stayed empty.
Okay. And how long did you have the restaurant?
I think they bought it around 1956, and it burned in 1958 or 59. I believe it was February, and it had a fire, and it burned. Didn't burn to the ground, but it was 100% had to be torn down, and that was the end of the restaurant.
And where'd you move after that? And then we'll start our tour.
I don't really recall. I think we might have lived behind. I was about 13. We lived behind Carlo's, was a building that Irving Gardner owned the building. He was a roofer and sheet metal worker, and they had that business in there. And there was apartments on the upper floor, and that was, you drove down the driveway between Carlo's and Dr. Murray Cohn's building, and that was it. And we lived there. Mm-hmm. And I was probably around 13 at the time.
Okay. All right. So now you're a 13-year-old. Take us for a walk on what it was like. This is now the late 50s, going into 1960 or thereabouts. And you walk out what's left of Pat Visco's, and you hang a left and you go to Broadway. You mentioned the Civil War monument. That's no longer on that corner, obviously.
Correct.
That got moved where?
That got moved to the park next to the steak pub. Okay. Everybody thinks that it went to the courthouse, but it didn't go to the courthouse.
Okay,
That's the Civil War monument. That's on Broadway, next to what would be the steak pub,
would have
which
been,
is
yeah.
now soy.
Right. Okay, we'll get to that one, and you can give us the iterations of that building in a minute. So as you make the turn, you pass the monument. What's next? On the north side of Broadway.
Mac Feller's jewelry store.
It was a separate little building, yes, as I recall.
Separate building.
Right.
And in front of the building was a very small replica of the building. It was maybe 3 feet wide and 2 feet high. And that was in the front yard. It was like a dollhouse kind of thing. And then came Young Street. Young Street was the next was the next property.
Okay. Then
it started at Angelo's Paravecchio's. It was a barbershop, Angelo's barbershop. And I'm not overly sure about the order of which the next buildings are, but Mel Gitlin's parents had a grocery store. Chris Typewriter Company was there, would have been next. And Rosenberg Furniture Store.
Clover Exterminator.
Clover Exterminator was in there also.
Now, the Rosenberg Furniture Store was a little wide, but my recollection is that both Clover and Chris were about 2 feet wide. The store was extremely, extremely narrow, maybe even Chris having merchandise only on one side. Clover, I don't think, had any merchandise to speak of in the store. It was just a place from which to work, as I understand.
I agree. I agree with that. But I remember it was Chris Typewriter Company.
Right.
Less Chris' parents had that.
Nudge.
Huh?
Nudge Chris, he was known as.
Right.
Nathan.
Right.
Okay.
And then as you went down the street, that becomes a little foggy for me. There was an employment agency, Gladys's Diner. There was a bowling alley.
You had Link's Butcher Shop.
Link's Butcher Shop.
And Aqua Drugs, Aqua Pharmacy.
Drugs. And then you got to where the steak pub is. All that ended up being removed because of urban renewal.
Eventually, yeah.
Eventually.
Was it dependable there or elsewhere?
I'm not sure if that was dependable or that was, I think that was dependable, and Meadoff's was on the other end of town.
Gotcha. Talk about what you mentioned, the steak pub. But let's go back to the beginning. First thing I remember was Jack Gershon's Steakhouse, which was just past these stores. And you wanted to embellish that because it wasn't just called the Steakhouse. What was it?
Right. It was Jack Gershon's Park Avenue Steakhouse.
Uh-huh.
And girl in my class, Robin, was the daughter.
There weren't many restaurants in town of that quality, as I recall. You had the Paddock way down East Broadway. And then on Broadway, there really weren't that many, sort of first-class restaurants besides the steakhouse, right?
Right.
There were delis and so forth, but in terms of formal restaurants.
Right, but people didn't move in those days. Like when the Homestead opened in Bridgeville, people would say, "Oh, who's going to drive all the way to Bridgeville?" I mean, that's so far. It's like, but you had the Hideaway, which was a good restaurant, but was that way out on the Port Jervis Road, which today is Solaria. Right. Yes. And they had a Fireside. I think the Fireside restaurant was out on Jefferson Street towards.
Wasn't there also another restaurant out towards where the casino is that ended up burning? Did Charlie Rappaport have that restaurant? Or I know Charlie had a luncheonette in town. The
Yeah,
paddock, yeah, no, past the paddock. Myron,
yeah,
put your phone on mute for me,
there
please.
was one. I think the fireside was out towards Harris, uh, past towards the Center for Discovery, towards part of the Center for Discovery.
Okay.
I don't
And there
remember
was,
that.
my recollection is also, because it's the first time I ever bowled, behind Jack Gershon's Steakhouse, or upstairs from it, I'm not sure which, was a bowling alley with pinboys. This is
Right.
pre-machinery. I think it was like a nickel a game that you had to leave for the pinboys. Do you remember that?
I remember it existed there, but I never bowled.
Okay,
So I didn't know any. I know they had to hand set the pins, like you
right.
say. There's no machinery. I don't really know anybody that was a pin person. A good person to ask would be Ed Cook.
Okay. Past that, now you mentioned Carlos. It wasn't quite at that time yet, but
Right.
Carlos became the pizzeria that was after the steak pub or Jack Gershon's place. Jack Gershon had a fire at some point, yes?
This I don't know.
Okay.
But
Carlos,
after, it wasn't Carlos right away. You had a building in between Carlos, which housed Dr. Savickas and Slavinkis at
right,
different times.
right,
Uh, and then came Carlos. It was the first pizzeria that they made the pizzas in the window.
right.
There was a big glass window in the front, and that's where they made the pizzas. And they cooked the pizza, and it was yeah.
Up to that point, we pretty much had Tuzio's on Port Jervis Road for
Yeah,
pizza,
that was the restaurant.
and the Rustic maybe all the way up Broadway at the corner.
No,
Where was the Rustic originally?
Rustic at that time was across from the Monticello Diner.
Ah, okay. You got me on that.
Downstairs. You went down steps like it was the down under later on, and there was a horseshoe shaped bar, and that was a pizza place. They moved from there up onto West Broadway. I don't know what year. That was probably in the 60s.
Okay. Now, after Carlos, what's now the park, as it were, and you mentioned the monument and so forth, but there were a few stores there.
Well,
Kaufman's Appliances?
the park is on the other side of the steak pub.
Yes.
And then the steak pub, and then and when you get down to Carlos, there was a driveway, and behind the driveway was, as I said, New York State Sheet Metal and Roofing, Irving Gardner's place and apartments, and then was a stone building, and that stone building was Dr. Murray Cohn's office.
Okay, we had a plethora of doctors in those days. We've only touched on 3 just in this little cluster. What after that? I think there was didn't Gitlin's? I mean, Kaufman's had a grocery store there. No, and Schwartz's originally was there next to Lashinsky's.
Right. Well, the next building would become Lashinsky's building.
Right.
And
which was the meat market.
Right. The meat market. And then there was probably Gitlin's, not Gitlin's, Schwartz's, you said.
Yep.
Because later on, there was in Lashinsky's, next to Lashinsky's was a deli, was Schwartz's Deli.
Right.
And that had a couple of different locations, one there and one over by Prince Street.
Yeah, across the street after the firehouse came down and after the new building had that fire, Schwartz's eventually moved across the street. Now I have listed here Butlin's Shoe Store. Does that ring any bells?
That does not ring a bell at all.
How about Decorate's barber shop?
Yeah, Nathan Decorate's father had a barber shop.
Okay.
Right after Lashinsky's, and from there,
Anna. How about Anna Last?
Anna Last,
Women's shop.
Right, and I think Dot's Corset shop and Anna Lass were the same. Dorothy's corset shop was Mrs. Wally Madnick's mother worked in there. It might have been her store. I don't even remember.
Okay.
But that was there a long, long time.
So these are all stores where currently Nellie's has the restaurant. Several of those stores became Nellie's restaurant for those thinking of where it is now. And then you had what's left of the Broadway Theater.
Yeah, the Broadway Theater was between Lashinsky's and the corset shop.
Okay. And
then
the
there
Broadway was only open in the summer, as I recall.
Yes.
And the Rialto was open all winter.
Right. Correct.
Okay. And then you had the big pharmacy after that.
Yeah, you had Spector's, which had a luncheonette in it.
Yes.
Walked in, and on the right-hand side was a counter with seats, and you could have lunch there and
or breakfast. Did you go to school at the garage, the bus garage?
No.
No. So I had sixth grade in the bus garage, and Spector's was one of the places that the bus would pick you up in town to go out to the garage. So in my time, all my contemporaries would come to Spector's and, I don't know, get a Danish or a donut or something at the counter and wait around for the bus to pick us up to take us to the bus garage. But there was a jukebox, Tan Shoes and Pink Shoelaces is what I remember playing on the jukebox every morning. It might have been a dime or a nickel. I don't know what it was.
But it was a box that was on the counter.
Well, the little boxes were on the counter, actually. There was a big box somewheres, but the small boxes were on the counter where you flip the pages across.
Yeah, they had that in Monticello Diner too.
Right. And now Mr. Feller shows up here again.
Right.
He moved down.
He moved down. I don't know why. It might have been
Urban Renewal.
It might have been part of Urban Renewal.
Yeah.
That he moved down there, and he was an older man.
Yeah.
No, in those days, everybody was older than me.
65 was old.
Right. Absolutely. And then there were post office. Then you had the post office.
Right. Okay, let's cross Liberty Street. What do we got next?
Well, you had the church. The church
St. Peter's.
St. Peter's has always been there.
And then there was Charlie's Restaurant for a period of time. Before Denise Morantz, my wife, her father built the Woolworth building, there was Charlie's Restaurant in that location, a separate, small, little, narrow building, as I recall.
And Morantz had a meat market there, did they not?
In the back, yeah. Before the Woolworth building was built, and then when the Woolworth building was built, their wholesale operation went in the back of that area.
It was always in the back.
And the Woolworth came in after that, which was probably around, I want to say 60 or maybe 61. I don't remember the year. Then there were stores that came in that took that space up after Charlie's Restaurant. We had National Shoes, yes?
Yeah. National Shoes was owned by a young couple. I think he was an Israeli guy who later they opened a shoe store after they worked for National Shoes because it was a national company, and they opened Ascot Shoes, which is up by Dr. Hughes.
Okay.
The guy that was the manager of the National Shoes opened his own shoe store, Ascot Shoes.
Okay.
Where Dr. Hughes.
Now I have after the Woolworths L&M Hardware. Does that ring a bell?
No.
All right. How about Herzog's Bakery or Hecht's?
Well, it was Herzog's, it was Hecht's, it was Trachtenberg's.
Right.
That was,
but not Katz's. Was it Katz's also in that location?
No.
Katz's was further up.
S&Z. I don't remember.
S&Z Bakery. Yes,
I don't
definitely.
remember Katz's, but S&Z Bakery. But the first bakery there I remember was Trachtenberg's. It was Trachtenberg's building.
Yeah.
The
Dr.
doctor,
Trachtenberg had the dentist's office upstairs.
he was upstairs, and Herzog was there. Hecht was there, but then Hecht later moved to Landfield Avenue,
Right.
next to Rourke's.
Right.
The bakery was there.
You could smell the bakery as you went down Landfield Avenue all the time. Smelled all the fresh stuff that they were making, as I recall, growing up. Okay, after that, now we're at some point, well, after the bakery, there was an alleyway, yes?
Yes.
And in the
And
back there was
it's
what,
still there
Green
today.
Door?
And then you had the alleyway, and now today the Chinatown Kitchen is the next building.
Well, but we had Green Door, yes?
The Green Door was up further.
Was it further
Green
up?
Door was up. There was a little tiny alleyway that went back to the public fish market, and the Green Door, or Murray Kay's Rendezvous, which was called later, was right there at that alleyway, which
Where
was
did
just up the street.
And where was Novi's? Further up?
No, Novi's was down by Trachtenberg's.
Right. Okay. I don't know what year they went out of business, but they were there for a while.
Yeah.
And how about Zank's Carousel Children's Wear?
Zank's Carousel Children's Wear was right there, and then it became Whitey Solomon had a candy store, and where Billy Zank had where the carousel was, and so did Lasher.
No, that's further up. I'm going to get to
further
that.
Up.
Yeah, that's past Gazar's. Lasher was up further. Yeah, we'll get to that. Lasher had quite an interesting turnover, and I have that down for later. Before we do, Charlot was ultimately in that area.
Charlot is where Chinatown Kitchen is. That was Charlot.
And where was Jack Brand eventually? Was that in that area or further up?
That was further up.
Okay. Lungen's Meat Market was there.
Yeah.
Gottesman's Gift Shop.
I remember Goddess's gift shop across the street next to the fruit stand. It was a little tiny building. It was Mac Gottesman.
Yeah, but he was on the north side when I was growing up.
Oh,
very tiny little store right. He had there. And Pick and Save Shoes apparently was there.
I remember the name, but I don't remember the store.
You remember the barber shop, Raddick's or Sol's?
Yes, Sam Raddick's father had that.
Right.
Yeah.
My grandfather.
Right that's just before Gazar's. And
right,
then later
before that little alleyway.
Right. It later became a photo shop. I think Ralph Cutler's had a photo shop there.
Yes, indeed. To go back a little further, my grandfather, Abe Scheck, was a barber originally before he bought the Delano. He worked at that barber shop for Sol it had to be the 40s, late 30s, early 40s, because then he became in the hotel business. So that barber shop was what can we say?
Staple.
Yeah, staple. You know, in those days, you go to the barber shop to BS, and people would sit around and kibitz. It's like the general store. You know, you find out what's going on in town. Okay, so then we had Gazar's, George Gazar and Rachel. And Rachel being from down south, adjusting to the Monticello. A nicer fellow you couldn't find than George.
Yeah.
Always pleasant.
And she never lost her accent.
Right. You mentioned Ed Cook, of course. He and George both, I think, worked behind the counter in Gazar's. They had that Breyer's ice cream. They used to make ice cream sodas and things like that.
Yep.
It was a very low squat counter, as I recall, easy for us kids to get into. When we were living at the Delano, we used to have to go to the Gazars to use the phone to call so that the bellhop would come pick us up in town. They were always very friendly and cordial about that, as busy as they were. After that, you mentioned Lashers. So here's what I have down for Lashers. When I remember growing up, Lashers was the guy with a mustache, and he had that apron, you know, where you put all the coins in the apron. At that
like
time,
a carpenter, like a carpenter,
like a carpenter's apron, and he had one of those grabbers because all the toys were up on the top of the store. And if you picked out something up there, you had to go get that grabber to go get the store. So Mr. Lasher was there. And then after Lasher's, I think it was Marty's. Marty Deitch had it for a while. Do you remember that?
That I don't remember.
It was Marty's, and then it was Pickers.
I remember the name Pickers.
Right.
But
and then ultimately it became Joe Roda's.
Right.
Which
and
was
right in that area was also a toy store.
We're gonna get there. Well, they had toys at Lasher's and Pickers and Roda.
Right.
But it's down a little bit. It's what's it? Carousel. What was Monty's? Darling store. Remember
right.
Darling?
People named Schlossberg owned it.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, they did. That eventually became Eddie Klein's clothing store, and that whole building was that he bought and changed it over. And then eventually the Streisfelds,
right, the elegant shop,
put in the elegant shops. So at some point after that, we had, I think, Bennett and Bleach, but that was a ways. You know what it might have been? The S&Z Bakery was up there. And you know where the little space is where those guys just recently did a beautiful mural? That's where S&Z was, in that space.
Oh.
Prior to Levy's Shoes, which was next to and then took over the old bank building, Sullivan County National, I think it still says someplace there. And you had Bennett and Bleach shoes there.
Right.
You remember in those days you would put your foot in that x-ray machine to see if the shoes fit right, which turned out not such a good idea.
Right. I remember that at Levy's.
Right. Right. Smith's Apparel was there.
Yeah.
Which is Judith Kay's, the Honorable Judith Kay, Judge Kay's parents, and she worked there. And then we got, I guess what was became Darling was Seneca stores originally.
Yeah, I saw a picture with Seneca. I don't remember the store as a Seneca store. I remember the Darling store.
Right. But, and then there was a bus station there.
Yeah, intercity bus station, Mr. Nelson.
And you went in to get your ticket there, but the bus was in the back.
Right.
The same thing for Short Line on the other side of the street.
Right.
You had to go in the back. What about the Rialto stores, the theater, and then there was a pharmacy next door?
Yeah, that was Sam Glick.
Sam Glick. And then on the other side of the Rialto was the Rialto liquor store, which
that was not on the other side. Sam was the last store in the Rialto building.
Yes.
Rialto Liquor was the first store, and then Rialto, and then Sam Glick.
Right. And then there was a store between the Rialto Liquors and the theater, but I don't recall the name of that. Steve's Casual Shop, ring a bell? Was that Steve Boker? I think Steve
Boker was I think Ralph Cutler's clothing store.
Okay, which he had before he opened the photo shop. Ralph, of course, worked for Ben Schacht at Boys Town for a while. Right. He got his chops in the clothing business.
And upstairs there was offices: Goldstein and Goldstein, Glick and Pickard, accounting firm. Later became Backrack. Washits. Well, many years later.
And Jerry Abramson, I think, had an office up there selling insurance.
No, Jerry worked when he first got out of college, worked across the street in where Oppenheim and Drew were, was a Weber insurance company. That was his
Jack
uncle.
Weber.
That
Jack
was his
Weber.
uncle, yeah. And then he moved down to where his father was on Prince Street. And his father had a haberdashery store
Okay.
on 14 Prince.
So we passed Levy's shoes. Arnold, and what was Arnold's father?
Sam.
White-haired gentleman. He
Yeah.
was not quite the same as the hotel owners, but that same kind of demeanor. Wasn't a warm and fuzzy guy. He was a good guy, but it was a different environment there. And then Jack Brand's menswear we mentioned. How about Crane's Pharmacy? Isn't that in that area?
Yes. Right. Cranes, and then there was another one up the street further. Was Cranes the same as Alpert?
Yeah, I think it might have been. And then we had Berman's. Eddie
Berman's
Berman,
clothing store, which
Theo
was
Berman.
Related to Herzog.
Right.
Related.
And A&W Meat Market.
Yeah, that was Freddie Albright.
Right. It was one of the meat markets that wasn't a kosher butcher,
Right.
but did well. And then you had the bank, Sullivan County National, and Sulco Radio and TV. For those of us who remember what it was like buying our first records, in the late 50s when Elvis and all those guys came out, we would buy records at Sulco before
Right.
Fleischer's had their store on the next corner.
Right, but the Carlton barbershop, or Carlton was in there.
Right, hotel and barbershop.
Right.
And what about Rabashkin's 5 and 10?
Rabashkin's 5 and 10, I remember as being up towards Alcone's.
According to what I've found, it was 242 Broadway, which is down around this area. But I'm not sure. How about Miller Automatic? Was that in the front or in the back?
Miller Automatic was in the back on North Street, and where Kaufman, I think Kaufman Alarm Company is. I think that was Miller Automatic, and then
No, Miller was closer to Broadway. It was back there, but it wasn't on North Street. It was in the alleyway just behind Broadway. It was when you come down Landfield and you hang a left, there's an ability to go through those parking lots. Miller was on your left at that point.
There was no, that was not Miller Automatic. That was Miller, but it was an EV appliance guy. It was a little tiny building.
Yeah.
And behind the building was an apartment. It was like if you came out of the movie theater and you exited the side door.
Yes.
You went right, and you could get there by walking down Levy's alleyway.
Right.
And you got there. But that was not a vending machine company.
You mentioned the Rialto and going out the side door. You remember Mr. Levicki was the patrolman or whatever in the movie theater for kids that were cutting up and carrying on.
Yeah.
And that exit was where you went. If you started up with him and he chased you out, you ended up getting thrown out the side door.
Right.
Yeah. Those days it's another story. Okay, so we're working our way up. Now we come to Johnson and Elliott yet?
Pretty close. Once you get past the Carlton, there was a giant. There was a laundromat there, which is now where Baum's office is.
Right.
There was a laundry called the Giant Wash.
Okay.
And then you got to a Stolman, I think, owned the building and had the Dictograph company in there. Also was that building. And then you got Johnson and Elliott and Johnson.
And then Kaufman's had the grocery store on the corner early on, yes?
Yeah, that early on.
50s, which became the radio studio and so forth
Well, it
later.
was, the electric company first.
Ah, okay. Which electric company was it then?
Nisig.
Nice.
Nisig was at the corner of Landfield and Broadway.
Okay.
In it was
Crossover
probably in the
land.
still in the 60s.
Yeah. Crossover now, Fleischers.
Yeah. It was
Became Cleansville.
Fleischer's became Cleansville, Napoli Pizza. After
Well, that's
that,
much later, but what I remember about Fleischers is that's where I saw the Beatles the first time in the window.
oh, for
Because
TV.
they had a color TV, I think, very early on, and you could go in the window and watch television.
Yeah.
And I think I saw the Beatles there. I can't recall. That would have been probably a Sunday night, Ed Sullivan. But after the Fleischers, it became Napoli's. But after that was Al Cohen's.
Right. Next building was outgoing.
Sports supplies. That's where we got our Keds. There were
Our
no
kids,
there were no
gym
Converse.
uniform.
You never went for Converse in those days.
Okay.
Keds were like probably $5, maybe $3, and Converse was $5, and
You
only
had to
the
get a
rich.
gym uniform.
Yeah,
Everybody had to have the blue gym uniform for school.
which was
And he
all of
thought-
about $3 or something at the time. And then Sedlak was among the ones that were in that next opening. Yes,
Yes, Sedlak.
Alan Gary have a place there for a while.
That I don't know. There was a Dean Phipps store there.
Ah, very good. Dean Phipps, which is what? Auto supplies.
Auto supply. Tony Cellini, I think, was the
Oh,
manager.
yes. Oh, yes. Very good. Good get. And then do we run into Hammond and Cook yet?
Right. Not yet. But Doty also had a Sears store in there.
Ah, great. Yep. Okay. And then Hammond and Cook, which was the building itself, a large building.
Right.
And then what's his name? Marvin Blumenthal bought that from Hammond, the Cook family.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think he did.
Yeah.
But that was later, much later in the 60s. Now I have down
I don't know about much later. My wife worked
for Hammond and Cook
for Hammond and Cook.
when it was owned by
Blumenfeld.
Oh, Blumenfeld. Oh, okay, good. Then I have down Mac Weiner Travel was over there at that point in one of those small stores before he moved across the street.
I thought it was across the street
Later.
I don't know when, but I remember it across the street.
And then we had McNeely's bookstore.
Yep.
But that wasn't United Cigar. That was down further. It was just called McNeely's.
United Cigar became Joe Roda also, I think.
Okay.
And McNeely had a bookstore up in that end.
And then Fountainleau.
Yeah. Somebody called the other day and asked what the name of the store was that Lou Sliper owned by up on that end, and it was Fountainleau.
Right.
I worked there at one time as a kid. I was a busboy, and you couldn't go. They sold waffles and ice cream.
Yep.
And you couldn't walk through the building with a bus box because it was too busy. And you'd hit people. So you go out the back door, down the alley, into the front, and pick up the bus box and go back up the alley. And so the bus box was in the front and in the back because you couldn't walk through the building. There was too many people.
Wow.
Couldn't carry it.
That's a great story. Yeah. And then wasn't there George's restaurant? Approximately, we're getting close. Yeah, George is the one that had the fire on New Year's.
Well, I don't remember that. It became Sandel's.
Yeah, that's a good get. I didn't remember that either for a little while. Yeah. But George's was famous for their fried chicken, as I recall.
I don't remember. I probably never went in the place.
And of course, the National Union
and then
Bank.
the bank. Yeah.
Right. Now we cross over past the courthouse lawn and we have what?
Once you pass the courthouse, you're at the Monticello Inn,
Right.
which
And
was
then
always
you mentioned under that it was rustic originally, then it became Duke's and D's and
D's.
Bernie's, yeah?
I don't know if it was Bernie's.
Yeah,
D's was there a long time.
Bernie was partners with Duke, I think, and
Mhm.
then went off on his own. You know, you mentioned before how they're going to find us out at the other end of town. Bernie Weinstein used to tell a famous story when he took the restaurant over at the Holiday Mountain Motor Lodge, which became Bernie's. He used to say, they'll never find us. They'll never find us. Obviously, 50, 60 years later.
Well, nobody drove. Where you going? You know. That's
Okay.
I mean,
So what else do we have? What else after the hotel?
well, after the hotel was what now
Trotters?
was the Trotter, but I think the Republican Watchman was in there.
Ah, yep.
I think Ruby Katz printed stuff there, and then
On
later,
the ground floor or upstairs? Ground floor?
ground floor. I don't remember anything upstairs.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All
And
right.
then,
Well,
and then Ruby moved out to Fairground Road.
well, but he was across the street for a while. They were across the street for a bit before the was it Herman's hardware store burned or torn down?
Herman's Hardware was the parking lot of the diner.
All right, we got to speed up if we're going to cover the other side of Broadway. We passed what was then the Victory Market, and the original Jewish Community Center was one of the old buildings there.
Yep.
The Patio Motel and Broadway Maintenance FBI office was in the patio.
Was in the patio. Yeah.
Was it Malak Paint Store? Is that what it was called?
That's what I heard, but I don't remember it.
And that became Reber's Real Estate.
Right.
And of course, Garlic Funeral Home, which is still there, and the Hotel Victoria, which was on the corner.
Right, and I don't remember what was in. Well, there's been several different little shops, and they had a Verizon telephone in there for a while. I don't remember what was in there prior, but the Victoria was there.
Let's cross over and work our way back up if we can. Perlmutter's Roofing was a big building for many years.
I don't think I think it was Perlmutter's hardware store. Perlmutter's Roofing was down next to Somers.
Was actually down at the bottom of the hill?
Yeah.
I remember
that's where the roofing and
I remember this big building on Broadway that was Perlmutter's. I don't remember the hardware store. I remember Herman's hardware store.
It was a big building that was empty for a long time.
Right
next to Gene's Tourist. But even when that was in the 60s, they still work the roofing part. It's now a window place.
Okay. And then after Gene's was the Crawford Public Library,
right,
which only until recently was on that site. And then Ralph Kerr's Buick,
right,
which was right on Main Street, which for a little while was Miller Automatic in the later years.
Yeah. Yes.
And then Vanilligen Funeral Home has been for a long time. Monticello Diner hasn't changed from the days we grew up. What was it? 35 cents. You could get a dish of spaghetti and a Coke after the basketball games. Or actually, for 50 cents, you can get a hamburger and French fries and a soda.
Yeah, everybody used to get French fries. They put it in a paper bag, 2 paper bags, shook it up, put your ketchup right in it.
A little salt, a little ketchup. Yeah.
There was a luncheonette on St. John Street. Sid Morden had a place you went to school with
yep.
Greg, I think. it was 25 cents. You got a hamburger, French fries, and a Coke. 25 cents.
You mentioned Greg. I probably didn't want to not mention the fact that you and I and Greg and Les Christ, whom we just interviewed, were all on the Rotary Little League team together. Jeff Gersten, Jeffrey Herzog was among the ones that were on the team. We won the championship one year. Somewheres I have a picture of us holding the trophy.
Yeah, I have that.
Yeah.
I have the picture.
Yeah. Okay. And then working our way past the diner, Herman's Hardware, which is now the parking lot for the diner.
Right.
And then what was originally Intercounty County Trust, Chase now. It had a lot of it. Was it New York? Was there a New York something or other? A lot of iterations for that bank. But when you and I were kids, there was Kennedy Candy Store.
I remember Kennedy Candy Store on St. John Street.
Right on the corner.
No,
Yeah.
I don't remember that.
It was on the corner of St. John's and Broadway.
Yeah. And then I remember them in down on St. John Street in this, well, not to get off of Broadway, but you had the Aries Pharmacy at the corner.
Right.
And then you had Sam Lee's Laundry.
Yep.
And then you had more the luncheonette.
Sid's, yeah.
Yeah, Sid's Luncheonette. And then you had a little tiny candy store.
Yeah.
And that was Kennedy's also.
Oh, it was the later version of Kennedy.
Right.
But when I was the smallest that I can remember, Kennedy was on the corner of St. John's and Broadway.
Oh,
and you went in and they had those penny candies.
Right.
Remember the plastic things with the liquid in them, and you pop them out, you take a little sip.
Yep.
And those dots on those long sheets of paper.
Yeah.
The sugar candies, stuff like that. Okay. So we crossed over. You mentioned the Aries, which became Lessons, which became Karatsiks eventually. Washington Liquor.
Yeah, Slim Washington, Ambrose Washington. Okay. He had a liquor store. Foster Little had a barber shop.
Okay. Was it Park Barber Shop?
Yeah, probably. Okay. I just remember Foster Little.
Now I had down Sullivan County Savings and Loan. Was that there? Does that ring any bells? That's Savages, though, you remember, right?
Oh, Savages, I remembered it. But Savages was down further. Savages was on the other end of
Rulin
building of what ended up being Rulin's building.
Right. We had Metropolitan Drugstore there.
Yeah, that was Art Cryer.
I remember Art, yeah. And Sliper had a paint store.
Paint and linoleum burned down.
Right. And Boys Town went in there at some point after they were further downtown and became Boys Town Men's World when they took over the larger part. And Rulin Insurance we mentioned. And now, as we're working our way...
There was also a bar in there. Trotter's was there.
Ah. Wasn't there a candy store also?
Rulin started out small, and then they took over the building, whatever buildings were there, and just enlarged their business. Even if it wasn't the same building, they drove it to make it into one building.
Right. And now we get down to, is it Dr. Breakey's office? Now we get to those individual old houses. Dr. Breakey and Dr. Hines, yes?
Yes.
Was in that same office.
Hines was on the right, Breakey was on the left. When I went in there, he had the old kind of telephone. You put it up to your ear and you're talking the thing. He still had that phone, had a roll top desk. I remember going, and he was in the left office, and Hines was in the right office.
Well, the only story I remember about Dr. Hines, who was a pilot, was, and this may be apocryphal, a lot of times the line went out the door in Dr. Hines' office, he would leave and go to the airport and fly somewhere and come back. People were still waiting in his office.
Oh, yeah. My mother, if she had to go to the doctor, she went to Heinz, but she would stay home. And she said, you call me and then I'll come in. You could call at 1 o'clock in the morning. The guy worked all the time. And call up 1 o'clock in the morning, my mother get in the car and drive up there. Give me 5 minutes, I'll go there, but I can't sit there all day. I had to work. She worked, so that's how it
Okay.
was.
Then we came to what the building that became Oppenheim and Drew Law Office, and the Methodist Church,
Mhm.
and now we have the series of stores. Zubrow's Central Food. I don't remember that.
I worked there.
Ah,
I know. So that Saul Zubau had this little convenience store. And he made pickles in the back. There was a little separate building, which had a walk-in box and had a little tiny fruit stand in the front. And the whole front was a fruit stand. And I worked there one summer as maybe a 14-year-old.
Perline Photography there at that time.
I remember the name. I don't remember the store.
Perline eventually went to Port Jervis Road. Yes, Monticello Photo, was that Perline? Oh, maybe not.
I don't know.
Mac Weiner Travel. He had moved
Yeah.
over from the other side of Broadway. A.G. Stanton and Montgomery Ward were in that bigger building.
Right.
Wolf's Tailor. Do you remember Mr. Wolf?
Yeah, he was in Oppenheim and Drew's building, I believe.
Yeah.
Him and Weber Insurance.
Prototypical old tailor, small guy leaning out over the whatever he was sewing and doing his thing. And he eventually moved to Oakley Avenue. I think he came off Broadway and went to Oakley, which I used to do there. Do you remember Wasser had a linen store?
Wasser had a little tiny, very narrow little store.
Yeah.
I thought that was up towards the church, the Methodist church, a little more. Maybe
Yes,
in that building that
it was past the church.
Yeah, right.
It
Maybe
was
in the building
just
that Glenn Smith was in originally, which is a fairly new building.
No, I don't think it was there. I think it was in the building, the Stanton building, or just before the Stanton building to the left, maybe to the right of Stanton. Joe Wasser had this tiny little linen store for a while. Then he eventually moved across the street upstairs because he didn't end up having linens on shelves. He supplied the hotels with the linen. But I remember the troopers because he was a judge, he was the town judge at the time. And you'd go by and you'd see troopers lined up in his store. They would bring the guys with the tickets. They would literally bring you there with your ticket to get it dealt with. And they would work out arrangements at the time. And next to that, I don't know, people don't remember, Boys Town was originally next to Joe's Wasser store. And again, Boys Town, like Chris, only had merchandise on one side of the store. It was too small. They couldn't put clothes on both sides, as I recall. And Ben Schacht and Judy had the Boys Town before they moved uptown. And then McNeely's was on the corner, yes? United Cigar?
Yeah, Shulman used to own it, candy store. I think they called it Maury's at one time.
Eventually, yeah.
And then they knocked it down and it became the electric company, and now it's a law office.
And Trotter's was there for a while too, because it was owned by a relative of mine, or a relative of my relative, Che.
Yeah.
Okay, let's cross Oakley Avenue and we'll work our way to finish up in a little while. Jack's Restaurant was on the corner before it had the big sign with the coffee cup that lit up on Broadway. And then Graper's Supermarket. Remember Morris Graper?
Morris Shillowitz.
Morris Shillowitz, rather, yes.
Yeah.
He was
Maxine's father.
Yes, he had there were no registers in those days for the, that you'd punch everything in. Everything was written on a bag, if you
Yeah,
remember.
that's what, when I worked at the Bagel Bakery in 1962, that's what we did. We wrote on a bag.
Exactly. And then I guess he might have had an adding machine to add it all up, but there
No,
was no, he just do it manually.
we did it at the Bagel Bakery when they had the fruit stand in the front. It was a scale that you weighed the fruit, but the scale didn't have only weighed weight. So yeah, everything had to be multiplied in your head. So if you're selling it for 69 cents a pound and you got 8 ounces, you'd have to say, 69 cents, that's 35 cents. You write 35 cents and you write it down as five, it would be a great big long bag like you would
Yeah.
get in a grocery store. And then you'd add it all up, and then the guy would pay you, and you had a carpenter's apron. You didn't go to
And there
the,
was only cash in those days.
yeah, there was no credit card. Forget about that.
Right.
And
Although,
I worked at the Bagel Bakery from 8 o'clock at night to 8 o'clock in the morning.
and there was
Only
customers,
nights.
and there were
Only
customers
nights.
all through the night.
Yeah, 7 days a week. You worked every single day. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're still busy. You're selling fruit.
It's hard to believe today.
That was in 1962.
Okay. Jimmy's Log Cabin was there.
Jimmy Edelson was his name.
Right. Catsy Paul had a place there.
Catsy Paul had a little luncheonette. Catsy
And then
Paul and Alan worked in the place.
eventually you took over the taxi stand. How many owners of the taxi stand were there?
Not too many. Ralph Myers owned it like 25 years. We owned it 11 years. That brings you into World War II already, if you're going backwards. My mother got it in 69. Ralph had it from the 40, right after the war. I think Julie Hocker had it during the war.
And was there a Reuben?
There was also a bus company at the same location. There was buses. So when my mother bought the cab company, she said, "What about the buses?" I said, "I'm not driving a bus." So forget about that. So Bernie Chonin bought the bus company from Ralph.
And he
moved
you park in the back too, or still, or no?
No, he didn't work out of there. He it was just a local bus run. They would have buses going down the Cold Spring Road to all the bungalow going, Old Liberty Road. But the bus came right down the Bagel Bakery driveway. Right. And a great big school bus. And people got on and off the bus. I don't know how they did it. I don't remember it. But the cab came down there for years. Came down, stopped, people got in and out.
Then there was you mentioned the fruit stand.
Yeah, fruit stand was in front of the Bagel Bakery. When I worked there, a man named Irving Teitler owned it. And
the bakery?
Yeah, right. The Bagel Bakery. But only open in the summer.
Right.
Labor Day, you put the doors in, locked them, that was the end of it. And then a few years later, they started opening weekends, and finally
So the Penny Arcade was there for many years.
Penny Arcade, but next to the cab was also the M&R Bar, and Brown's Beauty Nook.
Cantos Bananas?
Cantos Bananas was on Prince Street, next to the A&P.
Okay, so that doesn't go there. Frank Cohen's Menswear?
Yeah,
was just the other side of the alley, was on the upside of the alley.
They were from the cab office, and it was like 2 doors up.
Right. And was there what we had came to call crime school?
Right. It was Catsy Paul's, then crime school, then Frank Sportswear, where you rented a tuxedo, and Mrs. Brown, and then M&R Bar originally. M&R Bar became Mrs. Brown's. Catsy Paul's became Waverly Beauty Salon. Connie and Mo owned it.
Okay.
A crime school was crime school.
Famous food fair was what in relation to
The Bagel
kid?
Bakery
Oh, is what the Bagel Bakery. Okay.
was a
And
three-story building.
Brown's Beauty Nook.
Brown's Beauty Nook was next to the cab. As you faced the cab was on the left.
A.B. Wan's Meat Market.
I don't remember exactly where Abe's Meat Market was, but it was there.
Okay. And Lions Bar you mentioned.
Lions Bar became Harris's Bar. That was
Okay.
down by the bus station.
And Chester's Luncheonette.
Was next to the bus station. Bernie
Right.
Chester.
Bernie. And short line buses, of course.
Short line bus. You bought the tickets like you say, you bought the tickets and you walked out the back, and that's where you got the
Right.
bus. It was and they parked where the library's parking
Right.
lot.
Right. And then Daveco was originally Strauss stores.
Yes.
Okay.
But it was still owned by Davidoff.
Right.
Mr. Davidoff.
But Strauss was a known brand. It's like a franchise. Yes.
I believe so.
Yeah. I got my first baseball glove in New York at a Strauss store for $5. 4 fingers. Remember those? You know, you put the 2 fingers in the middle. It wasn't a 5-fingered glove.
You're talking to a catcher.
Well, you have 2 fingers. 3 fingers.
Yeah. Well, and you end up with no fingers. You continue to
Right, right. Okay, we're almost done. Prince Street. We got to the corner of Prince. There was originally, you and I grew up, there was a firehouse there.
Firehouse Police Department.
And you would hear the sirens and so forth. Now, at some point, they took it down. It didn't burn down. They took it down, yes?
They took it down and they moved. They moved to Pleasant Street.
Okay. And
the village office moved. The
right.
village office was there also.
Okay. Max Morantz built what became known as the professional building on
Right.
that. And it was the first place in town where there was an elevator. And it turned out nobody wanted to go up in the elevator. So we didn't do very well as a business. And when the first store that was in that newer building was Boys Town. They were on the corner, and then they had a fire, I think also New Year's Eve. And they ended up moving uptown. And that's when Schwartz's came in, where they redid the building. And then next to that was Morant's retail, Jack's Meat Market. And then Larry Kaplan opened up a candy store next to Morant's Meat Market in that spot. And I worked there when I was 15.
I remember Larry's candy store.
Yeah.
As when Gager moved to Bleachers.
Yeah, that was later.
It was Gager's originally, Gager's Diner originally.
Right.
And then Gager's Diner moved to where Bleachers is, and Larry Kaplan opened the candy
But his
store.
original store was in the professional building, because I worked for him the first year he opened. I was the day. I worked on the day shift. My cousin Steve worked on the night shift, and once a week we switched. So I got to come in and make, I don't know, 500 New York Times for Sundays. You'd have to sit there and make all of those things. And then we made milkshakes and malteds on the fountain, you know, for people. And it was busy.
Yeah.
I remember if it was a really good day, they made $1,000. In a really good day, he would make in a tiny little store with pennies and nickels, dimes, and quarters. Yeah. So it turned out it was a pretty good business. Kaufman's Appliances was in there originally before they moved way down below the hill.
Right.
And you had first, Ben Kaplan had a linen store, which became the dining room of Kaplan's when he closed it. Do you remember the linen store?
No, I don't remember that. I remember a
Okay, the
liquor
first,
store there.
yeah, well, that's afterwards. Kaplan's was where it is now, well, where the building is now. And Ben Kaplan had a linen store, and Ann took it over and made it a dining room. So you had Kaplan's had two stores together, the main room and then a dining room. And of course, I ended up working there for several years, as did so many of Denise and my classmates over the years, because that was obviously.
There was also later on a Paul's Fix-It shop in the professional building, which was a hardware store
On the corner.
on the corner.
After Schwartz went out. Yeah.
Right. And that, yeah, sure. Yeah. Schwartz was across the street by Lachinsky's and came over on that side.
Right. Okay. And after Kaplan's, you had David Rosen's liquor store.
Yeah.
And Stryfer's dependable employment agency was up the stairs or in the back or whatever. I don't remember. It wasn't on Broadway as such, right? You remember Harold Stryfer?
I thought that I forget where it was. I worked for his brother George.
Down at the grocery store down at the bottom of the hill.
Right.
Yeah. No, Harold's dependable, as they called it, was there. Because I can remember my grandfather at the Delano yelling and screaming, "I need a busboy or I need a dishwasher, send me one right away." And they would go down to the city, those employment agencies, and take guys off the street and bring them up, to be working in the hotels. Then, of course, we had the Canton, which was a thriving restaurant, did very, very well in the 50s and 60s, probably into the 70s. And then Gager's Diner, as you said, the actual old diner itself was in that place. And then Larry took it over when Gager's moved over to what was Bleach's.
And my brother had got it from Larry and ran it as a candy store. Aunt Tilly's, he called it.
Okay. That was what, 70s at least? Maybe later. Yeah. And of course, Gonzalez Motor was there. They were a Dodge dealer on the corner before they left. Then it became Todd Gallery.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Pelton Street, the next corner before, when we were real small, it was Salzman's Fabrics, which had a fire. And then Bleach's built the diner on that corner. Right. And Block's Garage, Seymour Block, right? Was the owner there.
Yeah.
And remember the guy, he had this guy Rebel, who used to pump gas for him. Big heavy set fella, balding guy. And you could almost understand what he said. And he'd come out, and those days it was like 13 cents a gallon, maybe, when I first started driving. And okay, crossing over Park Avenue now. I have Conway's West End
Amico station.
Amico, not Texas. Amico, yes. I didn't remember that. And then the Washington House. What was that? Which Washington?
I don't remember it, but they say Tubby Washington had a house where Aretsky's garage was. It was a Sunoco station. And they tore it down and put up a Sunoco station.
Okay.
And then Dr. Schwartz,
Julius,
where Burson is,
all the way up,
a brick house.
Right. And someone said there was a skating rink there too.
I don't remember that. There was I'll tell you, it's not on Broadway. Right behind Bleach's Diner on Pelton Street was a trampoline place.
Yes, I remember that for only a short period of time. And then behind that was the ice cream, was an ice cream distributor behind. Right. I can't remember. I think Billy Ponton's dad handled that or managed that or what have you. Okay, working our way up Broadway though, what we knew as the Capri came in probably in the late 50s. And then Eddie Block opened the the hip pocket.
Yeah.
Remember that? There's a
Hip
small little door in the front of the Capri. You didn't even know that there was a place upstairs. And all I remember, I went to dinner there they first opened. Victor Rosenblum was playing the guitar. It was one of these cozy, quaint, quiet places. And Eddie was there as the maitre d' host and brought you in. And the steaks were very good, but it didn't last very long. But
became a bar. Became
Yeah.
just a regular bar.
Was it called a steak pit too? The Hip Pocket Lounge and the Steak Pit, I think, is what it was called.
Yeah.
And then further up Broadway, and we're running out of space now, we're going to wind down. Doctors Lipson and Seymour Cohen had offices.
Right where Michael Zager had his office.
Right. I don't remember any other now. Glenn Smith has a place there now, and a couple of other businesses are there, but I don't remember businesses in the days when we were growing up, except Dr. Lipson and Dr. Cohen.
Right.
I always thank Dr. Lipson because he wrote me a note to the draft board, and I got a deferment without ever taking a physical. And he said your activity had a heart murmur from birth. And he wrote on there, Marvin tolerates his activity as a teacher very well. I would not recommend him for military service. And that was it. Never took a physical. Oh, by the way, the draft board was in across from the Monticello Diner, as I recall. What was the Trotters building?
When it was me, it was in the Masonic building.
Oh, over on the side by
you walked in the front door and you made a left. And Amy Minnis was in there.
Ah. Bank Street? Yes. On Bank Street, I guess. Yep. Dennis, we're running out of Broadway. We've been at it for a while.
You got plenty on side streets. You'll be doing those next.
Okay, we'll reschedule to do Prince, Oakley, Pelton, Park. There's stuff doing there.
Landfield.
And we'll try and do those on another time. But I thank you very much for your time and energy and recollections. And, I hope that you'll stay healthy, you'll be well, and we'll get a chance to do this again soon, and we'll add the pieces of the puzzle. For those who are listening, we thank you. We hope that this has been helpful to help you remember some of the things that you may have seen and visited and frequented growing up. And we look forward to continuing our local history. So thanks very much, Den.
No problem. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, thank you, Dennis.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
You too. Thanks. It was great.